Thank you all so much for joining us and welcome to the release of Learning from the Massachusetts Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness or MVP program in the Greater Boston region. My name is Rebecca Hurst. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the director of the Sustainable Solutions Lab at UMass Boston. The Sustainable Solutions Lab, or SISL as we like to call it, is a collaborative research and action institute focused on keeping historically excluded people and communities safe and healthy as our climate changes. We are a partnership of the Collaborative of Asian American, Native American, Latino, and African American institutes at UMass Boston, and 6 colleges and schools on campus. These are the College of Education and Human Development, the College of Liberal Arts, the College of Management, the Manning College of Nursing and Health Sciences, the John W. McCormick Graduate School of Policy and Global Studies, which actually houses all 3 of the report authors for this project, and the School for the Environment. I'm gonna introduce our participants today, and then I'll go into some thank yous. So today joining us, we have Gabriela Bocio Santos, who is the new Associate Director of the Sustainable Solutions Lab. She just joined us a little over a month ago, and it's great to have her on the team. She will be helping with the Q&A later. We have Nathalie Beaulieu, who is a partner from our collaboration with Université Laval in Quebec. Patricio Bellois, who is one of the report authors, Stacy Vandeveer, who is another one of the report authors, and Melanie Garate from the Mystic River Watershed Association, who will be sharing a little bit about the work that they have been doing with MVP. So thank you all so much for joining us. And I'm going to do a couple thank yous, and then we will get started. So first and foremost, I would like to thank our partners at Quebec Observatory on Climate Change Adaptation at Université Laval in Canada, and Oranos in Quebec, and CBCL in Nova Scotia. Excuse me. While this report is building on the work we did together, none of it would have happened without that partnership, and it has really been a pleasure to collaborate. Thank you to Natural Resources Canada's Climate Change Adaptation Program and the Government of Quebec. This is as part of the Quebec Research Funds and the 2030 Plan for a Green Economy that really supported funding the initial research that led to this current release. I want to thank the report authors, Professor Stacy Vandeveer and PhD candidates Patricio Bellois and David Solewski for all their work on the project. Thank you also to Melanie Wong for her work copy editing and designing the report, and to Gabriela for everything she's done to make this event a success. Thank you to those of you who are in attendance and those who weren't able to join, who supported this research through interviews or reviewing our drafts. We really hope that this work is helpful as we all work to make the Commonwealth more resilient. Before we get started, I would also like to do a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that UMass Boston is situated on the ancestral native homeland of those who walked here before us and those who still walk here. Keeping in mind the integrity of this territory, where the native peoples identify as Massachusetts, as well as their relatives and neighbors, the tribes of the Nipmuc and Wampanoag and their descendants. All of Boston was Massachusetts territory, with some areas shared by other communities, like deeds signed by Nipmuc sachems for what is now Roxbury and Wampanoag, and maybe others using the Boston Harbor Islands extensively. We should also keep in mind that for federal purposes, the US government only deals with the Wampanoag as a result of their federal status. So sometimes other Native peoples who lived or live here are ignored. We offer a land acknowledgement to acknowledge the historical legacy of colonialism by honoring and paying respect to the land, which was taken by conquest, along with the domination of the people who inhabited the land, and with it, the imposition of white supremacy. We do it to raise greater public consciousness of First Nation sovereignty and cultural rights as a small step toward equitable relationship and reconciliation. It also allows us to raise the questions of what it can mean to live in a post-colonial world. What did it take for us to get here, and how can we be accountable to our part in history? We do a land acknowledgement not only to acknowledge the historical legacy of colonialism, but also to acknowledge non-Western ways of knowing that holistically link mind, body, and spirit, and link the human and non-human in ways of knowing. We're acknowledging that the space we are in, the land we are on, are part of who we are and how we know the world. And it also allows us to raise questions about whose knowledge gets to be named, whose knowledge gets honored or invalidated and legitimized, and whose knowledge gets erased. It is an acknowledgement that the space we inhabit shapes what we know and what we consider to be knowledge, how knowledge is constructed, and what is considered legitimate knowledge, and who has knowledge. All of these are important questions as we think about releasing research that we're continuing to grapple with. So thank you again for joining us today, and let's get started. I'm going to hand things over to Nathalie Beaulieu, who we got to work with on this project as part of her role at Université. Nathalie?
Hello, thank you very much, Rebecca, for these introductory words. And I'm just going to say a few words on the larger collaboration, because this study, as you mentioned, it's part of a larger binational collaboration. So the title of the overall project that this study was part of is Understanding the Determinants of Effective Policy Instruments, Case Studies of Climate Change Adaptation in Quebec, Atlantic Canada, and Massachusetts. So I'll say the partners are all listed on the slide, but I'll explain a little bit how they came in later. So if you can present the next slide. So the context of this collaboration, actually it started in 2016 with the creation of the Massachusetts-Quebec Collaborative Research Council, and which was created by members of the parliament on both sides. So the Quebec government was interested in investing in this collaboration between Massachusetts and Quebec. And there was, in 2017, there was a call for proposals by Natural Resources Canada's Climate Change Adaptation Program. So that was an opportunity to match funds from both governments, and Uranos, it's an agency in Quebec, acted as a coordinating body, and it matched funds from Quebec and Canadian governments, and it networked between the partners who could actually do the work. So Université Laval it was leading the project since the beginning, and the other partners, well, the two universities in Massachusetts and CBCL in Halifax and other partners also in New Brunswick were involved in the research. And this is one of the projects that's informing the Coastal Management Working Group of Canada's platform on climate change adaptation. So next slide. So we had like a big project team because there were different case studies in the different locations. So Pierre Valois, he's a professor at Université Laval, who he was the project lead. I worked on the whole project duration, just about full time, and Lise Poiblot also helped us. Caroline Larrivée, Marie-Anta Diop at Uranos, Emmanuel Nicolescu, Leo Brasky, and Vincent Blaise, and well, the whole team in Massachusetts, which you will hear later on. And so next slide. So there were actually 2 case studies in each of the regions in the province of Quebec, Atlantic Canada, and Massachusetts. And out of these 6 case studies, 3 of them were on how provinces or states can support municipalities in developing adaptation plans or their adaptation activithis. So there were 2 case studies in Atlantic Canada, one in New Brunswick and another in Nova Scotia, and this third one in Massachusetts. In Massachusetts, we were interested in the Climate Ready Boston's planning process. So there's a shorter study, there's a shorter text in the report on the Climate Ready Boston planning process, but the team in Massachusetts expanded on the MVP program. And so that's what you'll see today. In the province of Quebec, we wanted to look at other mechanisms apart from adaptation planning could help further adaptation goals. For example, in Montreal, we looked at the regional development plan We looked at the environmental assessment of bank stabilization projects as a way of furthering adaptation goals. So next slide. So the bigger project actually produced two big documents in June 2021. So there was a final report, and there's also briefs on each of the 6 case studies, and there's a brief on the overall lessons from the project. So you have the links to these documents, and there's also so these reports are on the Uranos webpage, and there's also they're also on the OCAC website, the Observatory on Climate Adaptation in Quebec. Next slide. And so because this project aims at catalyzing collaborations, well, here are the emails of the people who of the Canadian partners in case you'd want to contact any. So I thank you very much for your attention, and let's hear about the MVP case study.
One second, I'm just preparing I think you should be able to see the presentation. Okay, well, thank you, Natalie. My name is Patricio Belua. I am a doctoral candidate in public policy at the Department of at McCormack Graduate School, and a research assistant at the Sustainable Solutions Lab. And I'll present the different sections and topics of our research authored by Dave Zulewski, Stacy Van de Veer, and myself. So a brief summary about this research project. I think Natalie said most of what it's important, right? It's a collaboration, but this is a more in-depth study with the different research questions, right? And that belongs to the large report. And then we're going to talk about Massachusetts and the MVP program, MVP processes, the workshops, vendors' participation, then a look at the regional climate adaptation, and then pursuing environmental justice through adaptation. Finally, Stacy Van de Veer will go on with some lessons we learned from this process. So about this research project, part of the series of 6 case studies, but this, as I mentioned, is a more in-depth one. Regarding this study, primary data collection took place between 2019 and 2021, with the bulk of interviews and attendance to workshops before March of 2020, when most in-person meetings moved online as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. We conducted 21 semi-structured interviews with MVP program staff, vendors, state senators, municipal environmental planners and conservation agents, representatives from environmental organizations, watershed association staff, concerned citizens, and advocacy group members. We also conducted participant observation at planning workshops in Watertown and Dartmouth, and conducted document analysis of MVP planning reports and action grants, public presentations of the MVP program, community resilience building worksheets, and others. To begin, well, one of the latest reports this year by NOAA confirmed that states in the US Northeast, including Massachusetts, are warming even faster than the global average. Different municipalities, local communities, and neighborhoods and regions of the Commonwealth experience these challenges and impacts differently, opening the debate about what mix of statewide and highly localized policy responses and investments are needed. With support from different environmental organizations, the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, or EEA, launched the MVP program in 2017 to provide support for cities and towns to identify climate hazards, assess vulnerabilities, and develop action plans to improve resilience to climate change. From the beginning, and probably due to the influence of these environmental organizations, the program had a strong focus on promoting nature-based solutions. Just some numbers about the program since its beginning. During 2017, for example, the first year, the program had a budget of $1 million for 71 cities to do vulnerability planning and prioritization of climate actions. Total investment until now is over $65 million. Enrolled municipalities until now are 95% of the total of the Commonwealth. And these numbers are slightly updated from the report as the MVP has released new information. The budget for 2021-2022 was set as over $21 million, almost double from last cycle. This shows that the program is in good health and enjoying support from the administration. That's how you get, of course, more budget. So for those less experienced or aware of the topic, the question would be, what is the MVP program? In short, the MVP program awards planning grants and action grants. The MVP planning grants funds municipalities to assess their vulnerability and prepare for climate change impacts using the Community Resilience Building Framework, facilitated by an MVP certified vendor. Once completed, municipalities receive designation as an MVP community. The MVP Action Grant is available to municipalities who are designated as MVP communities and want to invest in municipal priorities that build climate resilience. The range of possible projects go from planning actions to infrastructure to education. It's very broad. Following an introduction, the first part of our research focuses on three important aspects of the MVP program. The first is the workshops. Who attends? What is the dynamic in the room? Who gets to participate more and who gets to participate less? More details about this point can also be found in the section about environmental justice. I will talk later about it. A second element of the MVP process corresponds to the vendors. How do they connect with municipalities? Whether the hiring is competitive or not? And what is the role of MVP certified vendors beyond the facilitation of the workshop? We provide brief examples from Wellesley and Watertown, comparing them to what happens in other municipalities. Another element we talk about are capacity building. In principle, the MVP program aims to build the capacity of municipalities to advance adaptation efforts, since many municipalities lack the resources and staff necessary to assess climate-related risks and carry out an action plan. Although interviewed municipal officials generally approve the role of vendors, stating that they help towns achieve a climate change adaptation strategy in less time than it would take for municipal staff, among other reasons, some interviewees also suggest that a big portion of the learning via these stakeholder-driven processes might be happening among the vendors rather than more broadly within and across municipalities. We expand on this discussion in the report. A second section of our research focuses on regional climate adaptation. With some exceptions, Massachusetts has a little formal governance between the state government and cities and towns, but the regional level is important for climate adaptation. For example, hydrological issues cross towns and watershed boundaries, including problems in culvert quality and location that cannot be fixed only at one side of the stream. The MVP program has evolved to rely on two different approaches to promote increased regional and multi-city collaboration. One is the work of 6 regional coordinators around the Commonwealth who are MVP focal points for municipal core teams and facilitators. And they provide incentives such as, facilitators. And also the second would be incentives such as higher score for action grant applications that include other municipalities in their adaptation work. Besides their formal responsibilities, interviewees mentioned that regional coordinators have been effective at networking, connecting, and guiding vendors and municipal staff, expanding their roles to also collect feedback and support the improvement of the program. In addition to the work of regional coordinators, the MVP Action Grant selection process also allocates extra points to projects that demonstrate regional benefits, and if the project results are transferable and serve as models to other communities facing similar issues. The MVP Action Grant explicitly encourages partnering municipalities to submit a joint application, with one municipality serving as the fiscal agent for the award. Our research identified 2 regional multi-municipality actors who are trying to facilitate the the complex task of coordinating municipalities on climate adaptation at the regional scale, regional planning associations, and, where available, non-governmental organizations working in environmental matters and climate change issues. Interviewees declared that, for example, regional planning organizations provide planning, research, information, and convening functions for the communities across the state, but they have no decision-making authority and limited capacity to induce neighboring municipalities to collaborate. On the other hand, non-governmental organizations like conservation land trusts and watershed associations have been operating in the regions for decades, accumulating place-based knowledge, personal and professional networks, and have a reputation for supporting municipal efforts. In the report, you can find a brief profile featuring the Mystic River Watershed Association fulfilling this role. Finally, we look at the MVP program on adaptation in Massachusetts through the lens of climate justice. To do that, we use the framework for just adaptation proposed by Malloy and Ashcraft in 2020, which is not that different from what other authors have suggested in terms of procedural, distributive, and recognitional justice in climate change and climate action. The first principle is that just adaptation requires the full inclusion of socially vulnerable populations as participants who have agency to inform and shape the decisions that affect them. The second is that just adaptation requires recognizing the causes of systemic injustice. And the third is that just adaptation requires incremental evaluations of implementations to avoid lengthy evaluation timeframes inconsistent with advancing justice. We describe some challenges and good practices, highlighting strategies that the MVP program has adopted in order to make justice a focus of the program, as nature-based solutions have been until now. The evolution of the program has institutionalized toolkits and specific ways to overcome barriers to participation that environmental justice or climate vulnerable populations regularly find. We echo the good practices in community engagement already emphasized by the program in Oxford, Webster, Great Barrington, Natick, Framingham, Ashland, and Malden, among other cities and towns. We provide community profiles of Watertown and Hadley. And among other conclusions, we mentioned that a big challenge ahead for the program will be to amend some planning processes that, for different reasons, might have not been as participatory and inclusive. For the future, the MVP 2.0 should give municipalities a chance to conduct climate planning that is more equitable and helps advance the principles of just adaptation. And I'm going to leave Stacy now to continue with the lessons.
All right. Thank you very much. Can you see and hear me?
Oops. Can you still see the presentation?
No.
I'm sorry for that. I totally screwed up. Yeah. I'm sorry, all again.
That's all right. All right, so thank you, Patricio. That was a great presentation. I want to stress that what we were trying to do here, and I'm just going to talk for just a couple of minutes about these lessons, but I want to stress that what we were trying to do here is not a kind of sort of narrowly focused evaluation or critique of the MVP program, but again, this sort of idea that we are facing a complex set of social, political, and environmental needs and mandates and goals, including a set related to economic, racial, and other forms of social justice. And we have a complex mix of climate change impacts, technological both solutions and sort of a massive built environment around us, and a set of ecological goals. So this is an extremely complex area of policy making across local and state levels of authority. And so the idea was, what can we learn from these now 5 years of experience of this program about the challenges we face and lessons to keep moving forward, particularly in the context of the legislature and the governor's recent sort of push over the last year to some additional climate policy and climate policy goals. I think I'll also note that the MVP program is not essentially one program that was the same for 4 years. In policymaking and public policy, we often aspire to have institutions that change and adapt. And I think actually it's fair to say that the MVP and the people who are working hard on it every day have been trying to do that. So that in fact, they have reflected upon and changed aspects of the planning and action grants process and their expectations of vendors and a whole number of other things over this 4 to 5 years of study. I also want to take a moment as a policy researcher to thank the many people we interviewed, talked to, observed, followed up with, emailed, it goes on and on. Public officials, NGO stakeholders, citizens in the groups, vendors, all of these people have a whole lot more to do every day than they have time for, and they were still able to take time to talk with us, to send us things, to review the reports, the earlier drafts, and all these kinds of things. So many, many thanks to all of them. So let's focus just very briefly on our 7 lessons. The first here on advancing climate adaptation and dialogue, and these 7 lessons are discussed in sort of just a kind of paragraph form at the very end, sort of engender next steps of the report. Here we think it's clear actually that the program has really accelerated community level dialogue around climate change adaptation. If we go back just a few years, I think it was much more ad hoc around the Commonwealth. So the fact that well over 90% of the municipalities in the Commonwealth are participating, and that it has engendered meetings and discussions and city councilors and city offices and local stakeholders, I think is a decided improvement. One of the things that's much harder to assess, right, is whether or not this is leading systematically to kind of local municipal level of capacity building to adaptation plan in inclusive ways and for better outcomes. And you'll see that this theme repeats as we go through. And so I think thinking about what are the ways that state structures can induce a kind of constant increase in our local level capacity to grapple with these extremely complex and very important issues is one of the challenges before us. The second lesson we're calling sort of bottom-up variance and top-down goals. And here we're focusing really on the kind of tension between the desire and the need for local communities, local neighborhood levels, at town and city levels, for local communities to set priorities, to be able to debate and openly discuss them, and to try to figure out what actions to take first, second, and third, and how they might fund those. This kind of bottom-up dynamic is extremely rich. And the fact that that there are a bunch of top-down goals. We need for outcomes to be just and effective and efficient, and we need for those things to happen at the level of regions and at the level of the whole Commonwealth. And we see here a tension in how to get this done. And in particular, what you find is that it's difficult to assess. We've got lots of stories of things that are going well at particular local levels, but it seems to me quite difficult to assess how we'll know in the Commonwealth as a whole or in metropolitan Boston that we are confident we are becoming more resilient and achieving adaptation success over time. I'll return to this theme at the very end. The third lesson is about the sort of huge needs and the small and uneven and uncertain funding. And this, of course, is a perfect example of the fact that this is not a criticism of the MVP program, because the MVP, the civil servants who work in the MVP program are not, they're not setting the budget for their program, nor are they setting the budgets for a lot of other related programs to fund activities at the local scale. So what we see here is that this year's recent sort of doubling of funding, I think, is a very good sign. But we would need to see that continue. And probably, as you'll see, we need more evidence that we're willing in the Commonwealth to grapple with some really sticky policy questions and governance questions that adaptation brings up differently than say, the goals of mitigating or reducing emissions. Fourth, diversity, kind of marginalization, and participation in adaptation. It's clear that the MVP program has made great strides in trying to engender more attention to marginalized communities or environmental justice communities in the language of Massachusetts politics and regulations. I think it's clear that happening at the sort of discursive levels. It's much more difficult to see at the local levels around the Commonwealth's 300 communities what our level of success here is. So we have some good stories, we have some stories of its sort of absence that you get through interviews and discussions, but it's pretty difficult to see whether or not we're building, if the program and if the Commonwealth's sort of push for various kinds of diversity, equity, and inclusion and participation decision making at the local level, where is this yielding fruit? It was easier to see in cities and towns where they're probably already pretty good at this, and not as easy to see in other cities and towns that have tended to have a history of less effective sort of inclusion. And I think actually this is worth more of our attention on the participatory and inclusion side to think more about as we move forward. 5, regional adaptation requires regional institutions and authority. In terms of Massachusetts traditions, this is probably our most controversial lesson, because essentially it's a reminder that we are not structured for this challenge in the Commonwealth, that we simply do not have much authoritative governance at all between cities and towns and the state itself. So for example, you see in the report that while the Mystic River cooperation is achieving some really impressive outcomes and results in a lot of ways, in general, we don't have much river basin authority and cooperation. We don't have many incentives for the cities and towns in river basins to cooperate with one another. We don't really have a place to house this cooperation. So you get a lot of these sort of structural components. And one of the things we sort of raise early on and mention a couple of times is that if you look at the regional transportation authorities, or if you look at the MWRA, the Massachusetts Water Resources Authority, these are rare examples of some regionalized, real regionalized authority in Massachusetts. And they were created to meet particular challenges of their time, and we continue to rely on them today. And so I think actually we should draw a general lesson from that in terms of what kinds of regionalized authorities do we need? Patricio and I are not going to give you a direct answer to that question, but we think actually we think actually that we're identifying the gap. Should we have some river basin authorities? Should we have more coastal authorities? Should we be thinking more about how to govern some of these other challenges, whether it's heat islands and some related effects? And what would those kinds of things look like? Are there opportunities in the Community Preservation Act? Are there opportunities in home rule? These are all kinds of things that come to my mind. We don't discuss those level of detail in the report, but we are zeroed in on the fact that we do not have regionalized authority for both planning and implementation and authoritative governance in the Commonwealth. 6, climate justice, adding it on or building it in. Here again, I think this is not one that's directly aimed at the MVP program. It's about Massachusetts or about American politics generally, or policymaking generally. Everywhere in the Commonwealth, it seems to me, we are trying to figure out how to fit the growing awareness of needs around environmental justice and social and racial and economic justice into the existing policy systems we have. And you see in this example that there is some level of success in adding it in, but when we start to get to sort of building it in to really centering aspects of environmental justice, we start getting questions like, what do these communities really need? How can we get at the causes of our extreme inequality? And here, these things are obviously much harder to fit in to a program like this, but also that is in a way, that's the identifiable need. We need, in fact, for these programs to address participatory equality, but also outcomes themselves and reduce the causes of marginalization of some communities. And so here, I think, is an identification of the challenges we face as well. And then lastly, the very last one is many goals and too few metrics for assessment. Here, what we were trying to say is returning to this kind of level of complexity. that you've got broad social, environmental, and political goals. You've got infrastructure concerns, physical infrastructure and ecosystem concerns, and you've got goals about both participatory decision-making and outcomes and resilience and adaptation. And simply put, it just is not clear that we know from the available data and the experience how we would assess those things. Will we be able to say in another 5 years that this program or programs like it are making the Commonwealth a place where more diverse communities and more marginalized communities can participate in decision-making in Massachusetts in ways that they have traditionally not? Can we see the outcomes that are really changing the situations in terms of infrastructures, in terms of investments, in terms of problem solving in our environmental justice communities? And so I'll leave it there and simply say that we were hoping that this report helps to draw lessons from the MVP program's achievements, its challenges, and to sort of and to note, as the pages of the report do, the sort of reforms and improvements in the program in a relatively short amount of time. And we hope the 7 lessons contribute to our kind of next stage of policy learning as we try to meet the challenges of climate adaptation and the needs and the imperative of the challenges of environmental and climate justice and injustice. Thanks a lot. I think next up, I turn things over to Melanie. Thank you very much for joining us.
That's correct. Thanks so much, Stacy, and thank you, Patricio, for laying out all of those really important lessons and findings. I hope that my presentation really brings in the focus of what this is like on the ground, as the Mystic River Watershed Association has been a part of many of the MVP programs and projects. And so again, I'm Melanie Garate. My pronouns are she, hers. I'm the Climate Resilience Manager at the Mystic River Watershed Association. And I wanna just preface this by saying this is relatively based on my experience with the MVP program and those lessons that I've been able to grab throughout the process. And so to back up a little bit, we are part of one of those regional organizations that Patricio and Stacy referred to. We are the Resilient Mystic Collaborative. So we're 21 municipalities, 1 watershed, in order to tackle climate challenges that normally would be tackled singularity, and we're trying to do so regionally. And so this is a voluntary partnership of these municipalities. It was founded in 2018 and is about 98% of the watershed, with just a little bit missing up at the top. And we want to focus and have been focusing on equitable climate resilience strategies, making sure that we're not only focusing on the benefits of our most expensive built infrastructure and natural systems, but also focusing on people. And so that is the lens that I do my work with, making sure to focus on social resilience as well as infrastructure and nature. And so far I've been involved in 2 MVP programs. One is the Lower Mystic Regional Climate Assessment, which many of you were a part of that are in the audience or have been witness to this process. And so we asked 2 questions. The first research question was, what critical infrastructure is at risk from a 2050 1% coastal storm, and trying to understand essentially what would break. And adding to this is the second research question around social vulnerability. So what happens if the infrastructure fails? What would happen to the priority populations that live there? And this together shifts the central question from where is the most money at risk to who stands to lose the most. And this is a different process that it has not been done before, to my knowledge, around vulnerability assessments. And so this particular project was focused on the Lower Mystic, so the communities of Somerville, Charlestown, East Boston, Winthrop, Revere, Chelsea, and Everett. And we had significant partnership between municipalities and CBO, and significant amount of funding for the CBOs, and then also for the communities who participated in many of the intake instruments such as surveys and focus groups. And so without all that, it really wouldn't have been equitable. And I'm trying to run through these projects quickly since I have a little bit of time. You can find more information on these projects on our website at resilient.mystic.org. The second project is Wicked Hot Mystic that we're finishing up by the end of June. And this is a mapping project to engage, in order to engage volunteers around extreme heat, have them help us collect ambient air temperature and air quality data. So this was done last summer during an extreme heat wave, which is categorized as 2 to 3 days above 90 degrees. And we use this data to create a detailed extreme heat map to understand the heat islands and cool spots of the Mystic. And so the whole purpose of this project is not to stop there at the research, but to continue and help us then apply for more funding to plan and develop cooling infrastructure projects in the regions where the hotspots reside, and then to also gain some insight as to where were the cooling spots and what is there, what made them cool, and how can we incorporate that into those hotter areas. And so throughout all of these projects that I helped to co-lead, as well as others that I've been a part of, I've put together some successes and opportunities for growth in terms of the MVP program that really is pretty in line with some of the things that have already been said by the project team at CISL. And so some successes to start off with in terms of the overall MVP project. This program itself, I cannot underscore more, is a huge step in the right direction for the state of Massachusetts to tackle climate resilience projects. There's so many things that have been done because of this program that wouldn't have been done otherwise, that we would still be scrapping resources to obtain. And so this has been very helpful for the municipalities to lead and to take ownership in. And the factor that one municipality needs to apply, but they allow regional projects, so other municipalities to come in and work collaboratively on these projects, has been very, very important, especially for those lower resource communities to partake. And so we know that staffing is an issue everywhere, and staffing is a major issue, especially in those lower resource communities that need climate funding the most. Another important thing to know is that there are very dedicated and accessible program staff from MVP. From my perspective, they're very able to answer emails or to hop on a call if we have any questions before actually applying, and once you've been awarded the grant. And so that has been really helpful for the whole process. And they're also open to hearing feedback and criticism. And so they have been able to meet with us and with multiple partners in order to make this program better. And on that end, as I think Stacey mentioned, they have created an MVP 2.0 process, meaning 2.0, making it better for the next future for the planning grant. And so this shows that they are listening to feedback and want to do better in the long term to help communities prepare for climate. The grant application itself is beginning to institutionalize the inclusion and prioritization of EJ concerns. There is much more to say about that, which I'll get to, but the fact that they require a description of environmental justice communities or those who face more climate hazards is really important in the grant application itself. It's also very important that they do have lots of points for community engagement in the application. And so it's structured in there. It's not an add-on that you get extra points for. It's something to shoot for and make sure to include and think about as people are writing the grant itself. And the fact that the MVP program prioritizes nature-based solutions is incredibly important for both people and obviously for nature, as making sure that including nature-based solutions is actually improving the quality of life for people. And so that is very, very important to think about as well. And then some opportunities for growth. And I'll start here in terms of what we've learned, especially through the Lower Mystic Regional Climate Vulnerability Assessment, long title. We have to make sure to co-create the community engagement process while creating the project, just as we talk with engineers and architects about what is feasible for what we're creating in terms of the actual physical projects of resilience. We have to do the same for community engagement and environmental justice communities. One of our project team members said it best, as they said, giving people money to do work they did not ask for is not exactly consistent with principles of justice. And so that is to say, engaging the community after we already have the money to do so, and they didn't ask for it, is not necessarily the best way to go. So we have to make sure to include them from the beginning as much as possible. And I'm not saying that we've done the best at that either. It's something that we're still learning to do best. In terms of the program overall, it would be very important to create some sort of easy file application for lower resource communities, because it's very hard to apply for. It's a big lift for us who have the time and energy to do this. It's so much of a bigger lift for communities that are lower resourced and understaffed. The reimbursement-based structure for lower resource communities is also very difficult. And so upfront grants for those communities may be better than the reimbursement model that is used right now. And one thing that comes up over and over is 1 to 2 year projects makes it hard to do meaningful engagement. And so you can have engagement, but is it meaningful? And also monitor that the communities that you're targeting, all of those environmental justice communities that you described in the application, are they actually benefiting from all of the projects that are creating? What is the method to actually monitoring that, if there's one at all? So that is something to consider. And lastly, on the program overall is, as always, more funding is needed, and this is very, very critical. So it has increased, as was mentioned earlier, but we need, I think, an order of magnitude more for climate if we really want to keep up with the pace of the changes in the state for the benefit of community. And the last thing I'll walk you through is more specifics on the community engagement. And so it might be better to actually create community engagement grants specifically, even before the action grants, or make it a better process in the planning grants themselves. It's very easy for many projects to fall back to, let's just check the box on engagement by hosting one meeting where perhaps 5 people show up and they're all city staff, for example. And it's very easy for 2 municipalities to have very similar engagement plans, and one municipality try very, very hard and include many professionals, and the other not have many professional engagement people in the mix. And so you don't get the same outcome, and it's not actually equitable, it's not intentional, and it's not meaningful. And so I would really encourage the requirement of including engagement professionals in the grant, similar to how we would include engineers and architects for building these projects. We also need the same. There's a huge need and missing opportunity for let's say a community engagement firm. And so this will help build the field, because there will be an increased need. And lastly, many partner CBOs are working at capacity all times. And just because they're partner CBOs doesn't mean that they necessarily know the issues around climate or know how to connect them. And so there's still a great need to build on all of that. And so I will leave you back with the quote from earlier, that giving people money to do the work they did not ask for is not exactly consistent with the principles of justice to really again, emphasize that we need to do more work to engage our environmental justice communities and those most vulnerable in this work. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Melanie, and thank you to all of our presenters. I invite you all panelists to turn your videos back on for this brief Q&A. We have about 9 minutes left, so I think I'm just going to pose you a big picture question, which is, what is the added value of doing a municipal adaptation plan versus incorporating adaptive planning into all municipal planning? And so I'll let you sit with that for a moment, and then whoever feels like they would like to jump on that question first, you can unmute.
I'll jump in just very briefly. I think it's a great question. I think we should hope and aspire to eventually not needing iterations of municipal adaptation plans, because we will, through doing it maybe a few times, get much better at it being central to our planning. And I think we can say very similar things about Melanie. That was just wonderful stuff there about the ease with which old habits, like ticking the box because a certain kind of thing is required, don't serve our purposes across both ecological and social goals. And I think what we have to do is be deliberate and say, yes, we're learning how to do adaptation planning and we're learning how to do it better, but that has to inform our whole general practice at the municipal and state level. It can't be just something that the one person in a city. I live in Malden, so there's going to be one person who's kind of in charge of this kind of planning in our planning office. It's not large, right? So it can't be that person's job to worry about it. It has to be, eventually built throughout our municipal and state institutions. And I think that's the aspirational goal, but it may take us doing it in a more narrow fashion several more times because we have to learn and change the way we do things every day.
I'll just compliment by bringing up some experience. I was supporting efforts of the European Commission Climate Directorate on mainstreaming climate adaptation into EU policy some years ago. And it was a great task, but at sometimes very frustrating, because you have to go again and again, right, and in different pieces of legislation and negotiate a lot regarding transport, regarding, different aspects that need different solutions. Some of them need a complete reformulation. And we know that some MVP projects, right, are helping mainstream some climate adaptation into regulations of municipalities, and they are doing a great job. So I second Stacy in saying that we don't need to do this every an iteration that takes us that long. We have to learn from those that have worked better than others, and then start showing, this is how you adapt not only your ecological, social, and technological systems, but also your regulations and bylaws and so on. So just a comment. Thank you.
Thank you both. Natalie, were you going to jump in?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that also in the larger project, we saw that, adaptation planning just alone is not enough. You have to you have to incorporate the learning you have there into the municipal or regional planning for it to actually get done. But sometimes there is added value in doing adaptation planning, because often your land use planning or your regional planning or whatever is such a big box to open it, and it's not done regularly. It's not done every year, or so sometimes it takes a very long time to do it, and it's a big task to review that type of regulation. So there is added value in doing adaptation planning and having this convenient engagement process, and then working towards have it incorporated into interregional planning or municipal planning, but also when you do your municipal planning, you have to include adaptation planning in it, you know. So I think both are really important, and you can't say one is better than the other.
Thank you, Nathalie. Melanie, would you like to add anything to that?
I actually was having connection issues in the beginning. And so if you could repeat the question, I think I got it, but just want to make sure I'm answering properly.
Absolutely. The question was around sort of the added value of doing municipal adaptation plans versus incorporating adaptation planning into all municipal planning. And so we were weighing sort of like the pros and cons and the combination of.
Well, I'm all for regionality. Yeah, regional adaptation is very important as climate resilience or climate impacts are not felt one municipality by one municipality. And so having that regionality is very important to this area in particular, in regards to flooding. I would say it's slightly different in terms of extreme heat planning, as things are more siloed there, and previous urban planning policies have affected certain regions differently, such as redlining.
Thank you, Melanie. I wanted to share with all of you also, we got a question in the chat from Patty asking about, you know, there are certain situations where nature-based solutions are not the appropriate answer and can actually make the impacts of a storm event worse. So asking about that relationship and how decision makers can be open to resolving these when nature-based solutions are not practical.
Just quickly, that's exactly right, that comment. I think the value of including them in the MVV discourses and in the state's plan is because, like with climate adaptation generally, I think you are trying to elevate the idea, the concept of nature-based solutions. These are experiments going on all over the world. And so I think that part has tremendous value. I live in Malden. I'm not very far from the Rumney Marsh, but other parts of Malden are extremely dense already. So even in one community, there are some real potentials in a few places for what you might think of as a sort of larger scale nature-based solutions. But in much of our communities, we would be thinking about nature-based solutions on the very small end of the spectrum, you know, very small places to hold a little bit of water, you know, what you do besides replace culverts that add to, you know, the sort of natural environment. Right? So, I mean, like, these solutions under this wonderful concept vary in scale, and they are indeed some particular types of nature-based strategies are only applicable in very particular contexts. And so, you know, it's a very rich area, but it is indeed no one size fits all there.
It's one of the tools at our disposal. Well, I want to thank you all for your time, for your work. I want to thank all of our partners. I want to turn it back over to Rebecca to close us out. And I want to thank everybody who's joined us today.
So much for joining us for this. Sorry, can you hear me? Yes. Okay, great. Thanks everyone so much for joining us for this presentation. And as we've shared in the chat, the full report is available on our website. And we look forward to continuing to explore these questions together and keep working toward greater resilience for the Commonwealth. Thanks, everybody. Take care.